to say your taste in the introductory musics is very strange. I get a weird feeling when I listen to it.
That's my friend Philip Daniel. He's a composer, a modernist. Well, I wouldn't say modernist, but yeah, classical composer, and his stuff is great. I use all of his music for the buffers when I do the solo stuff, and yeah. Um, so yeah, I think I don't know. We talked on a Twitter space, on a Twitter space? I don't know.
No, but I always see you lurk, and whenever I start talking about Spengler and the arts, you always do like the Soyak face, like the surprise face, and the
Yeah,
thumbs up. So I could tell you were really interested in it. So here we
yeah.
are, right?
Here we are, exactly. Yeah. Um, yeah, that's great. And if I'm not listening, I'm probably listening on my alt because certain spaces, I don't know, it wouldn't be optical for my main account to
Oh, I
be.
see. You're
Yeah,
practicing good OPSEC, good operational security. Is
exactly.
very very smart.
Well, every time you like enter, I don't know, like a Smeed space or a Martin space, you know what you're gonna get. But and of course, this going up on YouTube and Anchor and all, and well, I know Well, the way I do it is that the more spicier stuff we'll get into, I will paywall. So don't censor yourself. But I mean, just like certain words on YouTube, you probably know the drill.
Yes,
But
I
if
cannot talk about Spengler and what he says about modern dance. So yes, this is good. He says
Yeah,
it has certain Africanized tendencies. I will not say this.
well, we could talk about that. Like, yeah, we'll just have to even the paywall we'll have to dance around because it's funny how Baron Evola and Young both came to similar conclusions about America. But well, I think like I wanted to ask you about Spengler's rating on Russia as well, and the second religiousness. But anyway, so let's do the introduction. I'm curious to ask you because I think I remember this must have been, I want to say, during or before. How can I say for you? I think you could say, yeah, let's call it the CVidian era. I noticed your account, and so I usually ask the general introduction question. So, who are you, Spergler Acolyte? What do you do? How did you venture onto this thing of ours, the E-Right? And we could get into questions about like what, from your perspective, the sort of purpose and well, the purpose and like what your purpose is, but also like the direction and purpose of, I would say, like the E-Right in general, or if you even want to call it that, because I like the online right because all the other names have either like negative connotations or they've outlived their usefulness. Even like this term dissident right is not
Yes,
exactly apt. Yeah.
I prefer the radical centrists. We are radically central. So
So yeah, the sensible centrist. Yeah.
yes, very centrist. My beliefs.
Exactly. Exactly.
But
But yeah.
sure, I can get into this. So I guess for me, I wasn't even a part of any of this until maybe about a year ago. For me, I was reading Spengler in 2019. That's when I kind of, maybe 2018, 2019 is when I first came across him. And up until 2020, I had been kind of reading him rather in depth. And then at some point in 2021, I discovered Bap's show, but I didn't even know about this whole Twitter scene until maybe even like a year after discovering Bap's show. And once I had found that, I was like, oh, well, this is perfect. And maybe I can make this account and people will listen to my whatever I have to say on Spengler because I've been reading him so in depth. And
Oh
well,
yeah.
it seems like there is a bit of an appetite now, although I don't know if I'm exhausting it now. These things, they come in cycles, right? So where are we on the Spengler cycle? I don't know.
I noticed there's some pushback by certain people, not to name names, because some of them are friends of mine, but there has been sort of like exhausting something like the Spengler research into like, oh, well, we talking about Spengler now. It's like back in 2015, we were talking about Evola and Gugnan. Now it's like, now it's Spengler. But yeah.
I will
Uh,
name the names: Theognis of Megara, Doggo Supremacy. I know who you are. Okay.
yeah, good friends of ours, good friends of ours. But it's funny though, so you didn't come in like, you weren't even lurking, I guess, at the original time of Frog Twitter. You sort of
No,
yeah.
Yeah, I had no idea about any of this. This is all new to me. I still don't understand half of it.
Yeah, that's very true because I was talking to a friend of mine who was talking about this because he's like, "Well, Gio, you know so much about this deep lore," and I go, "It's sort of it's very interesting when you come in the middle of something and you can parse out like you can get a sense of like old rivalries. It very much is like if you started up, I don't know, watching Monday Night Raw again. It's like, oh, like this is who's this is who is an alliance, and this is who's in a storyline together. Um, but that's interesting though that you have sort of fresh eyes on the perspective of it. And how would you contextualize this thing of ours? Like, what's your opinion of like being? I would say you're coming more into the center of it as a poster, as a writer, at least in my opinion. You- so what's your perspective on yeah, the current state and the future of this thing of ours?
Well, there's a lot of divisions, right? The past few nights, our good friend, the Fisher King, he's been having quite a few glasses of wine, some beers, and he's been letting loose on these Twitter Spaces, and he's been giving us his unfiltered opinions on the Amar Knights, essentially. And he's not a fan, and there's these serious divisions that I see, but
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to be like, what the end goal is, or what's going to come of it. I think a lot of people are going to go the normie route, and they're just going to be a part of this new wave of like right wing Tucker Carlson normie, non-anonymous Twitter accounts, that sort of sphere,
Yeah.
versus the more anon Amar Knight perhaps sphere that is just purposefully edgy. And I certainly consider myself more on the latter side. I don't really care about getting a retweet from Jack Poso, whatever his name is.
But it's funny because from my perspective, like I am not an anon, like I am a face, right? Um, and I use my real name. But it is interesting because I do have a lot of underlying sympathies towards the anons. I mean, the anons, in my opinion, are vital and integral to this, not just this thing of ours, but the way in which communication on the internet has manifested. And I think, I mean, we'll get to, of course, like the whole topic of this is Spengler. Um, but in terms of like the e-right, I do notice that there is starting to create this division between, for lack, not just them, but like for lack of a better term, let's say the Amarnites, Bapian vitalism, uh, the E word that I'm not sure I could say on YouTube, but maybe I could censor it out. So don't censor yourself. But I noticed that there's a division between that and in sort of older traditionalists and religious types, which I'm more aligned on, but yet I mean, man, I've survived so long just being a fence sitter in some ways. But do you notice that this division is sort of it was there back in the day, but I noticed that now it's reached new heights. That these like younger Zoomer anime posters have come into the mix, and a lot of their criticisms I think are valid, obviously, of a lot of the older iterations of the online right in terms of certain let's call them dilettante flights of fancy into things like third worldism and a heckin' wholesome based in a woods, you know, Pol Potism or whatever. So, you know, but maybe it's just relitigating old battles. I mean, what's your certainly like? How do you feel about the current divisions of things?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to like generational divides. I think this younger generation, which I guess I'm a part of, or not guess, but am, uh, the way we see things is just very different than some of like the old guard, right? I think the old guard had their coming of age on the internet on a very different
Yeah,
era in which it was more based on forums, right? Forums and things of that nature, but also a time in which the internet wasn't the totality of life. That these people were still doing things IRL, so to
oh
speak.
yeah,
Meanwhile, my generation, I think so much of our socialization was completely online, and consequently, that has certain effects on our development. The things that we're interested in are just extremely different. You know, one of the most recent episodes of drama that I've been involved with was like the whole Medgold affair,
oh
and
god,
there's like a lot of people in my generation, and I understand where they're coming from, where they just do not want any sort of Medgoldian discourse because they see it as just inherently Coomer, right? That's like
Well,
what
I
it really
mean,
comes down to.
full disclosure, I mean, I do as well. I'm not a fan of, but without, I mean, it's pretty public. But yeah, go ahead, Spergler, go ahead. Yeah,
I mean, yeah, the critique is that this is like a sort of Coomer behavior. Um, and I mean, I don't want to get into like the psychologizing of it too much. I mean, there are certainly some aspects where the younger ones are very correct that we live in a disgusting, dysgenic country with a lot of ugly people. It makes sense, and that's going to have certain effects on like the dating pool.
oh yeah.
But the other side of it is just like, as cringe as it is to say, they just don't want to have a normal one. It's they just don't, and I understand why. But the older ones, they do kind of want to have a normal one, and that's something that they'll probably never get out of. It's just too ingrained in their development. It's too late for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, I like to. I don't know if I'm that special, but I'm sort of an old head, little 30-year-old millennial boomer that never had a normal one. So maybe I'm in a unique position, but I understand what you mean. I think that there is a logical middle ground. I mean, oh God, I know it sounds cringe, but there's a logical middle ground, I think, between the excesses of like that type of posting that converge into Coomerism and the very valid critiques of a lot of these Zoomers, a lot of these incel twos that, and listen, I know, listen, okay, I know Atrazine Groiper made that term up as a joke, okay, but I still think it's a valid term. The incel twos, but like a lot of them do have a valid critique of the sort of mindset that a lot of the older millennials have, and they probably don't get it because they're so instantiated in this generational crossover between the quote unquote before times and the Wired, right? I don't know if you have you ever watched Lane Spergler? Are you a Lane fan? You a Lane head?
I am not, although I have many friends who are upset at me that I don't watch as much anime as I used to. So,
Oh yeah, but yeah, you know what? Yeah, I think you were getting at an essential truth though, that there is this divide, and I think that um, there's obviously critiques of the other side as well. But it is, yeah, it is a very sticky topic because a lot of people have their instantiated opinions, and there's validity to them. And the problem I have though is I think that and the recent drama revealed this, is that I feel like just saying that, well, the incels need to have a normal one. These younger Zoomers need to just like, I don't know, go down the path of youth culture that has been created by the boomers, that was instantiated by the Gen Xers and millennials. I don't think that's the answer. But then again, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm just being too deferential. But I think that there's obviously a reason, and this is a good bridge to Spengler as well. There's obviously a reason as to why the certain manifestations of youth culture on the internet age are the way they are. And but what are your thoughts on this? I'm just rambling right now. So
I mean, I don't have any. I don't know. I try to stay away from some of this, and I just try to be a humble Spengler poster in a lot of
yeah,
ways. If I want to like try and like connect it to Spengler, I mean, I don't know. Maybe later on we can talk about what Spengler says about like having children and like when it
100%.
becomes. Well, here I'll give the skinny of it right now. So what Spengler says is that the reproduction of any species cannot be something rationalized.
Yeah,
That the bugs and stuff that go out into the wild and just fornicate and reproduce endlessly in this eternal cycle, they're not thinking about it. Animals don't have any sort of rational faculties for them to kind of evaluate the pros and cons of reproduction. If they did, they would surely say, oh, this will be like a burden or a waste of time, and therefore I shouldn't do it. And then consequently, that logic basically destroys the species. And
yes,
what Spengler is saying is that at a certain point in a culture's development, it becomes too rational. That rational faculty becomes dominant. And that's how you start to get like the decline in that birth rate, because in some sense, you could just say we're too smart for our own good. We're thinking of it too hard. We're trying to apply some sort of logical principles to something that has to stand outside of logic because it's just a part of an eternal, irrational cycle, not irrational, but just irrational, outside of it. And what happens is, culture too smart for their own good, too kind of economic in a lot of ways, like calculating pros and cons, benefits and costs. And, the calculus that comes up is that like having kids is expensive. It's a lot of work. And therefore you should just kind of drop out in a lot of ways. And that's how we see kind of the decline of the birth rate, because we're no longer people really guided by instincts, natural instincts that all just animals have on like a zoological level, just to continue the species. But I don't know if we can say that this new generation is, Spengler is like last man somehow, like, becoming incels to like drop out. Like this is some sort of indicator of Spenglerian destiny. But there might be something to it. There is certainly a rationalizing aspect of it, because what think about like what having a normal one really means. Isn't that just like instincts? Because why is it normal? Because it's instinctual in a lot of ways. And what's like our phrase here? Are we calling them just like the incels? These are my people. I don't want to insult them.
Let's say, well, I like the term Truso, but let's say sensitive young men. There you go. That's
sensitive young men. That's exactly right. Sensitive young men. They're thinking about it. Like I said earlier, they're looking at the dating pool. They're doing the cost analysis, like how much the cost and benefit analysis.
Right.
How much effort I'm going to have to put into this? What am I going to get out of it? I'm not going to get much out of it because the prospects are extremely poor because everybody's not that great looking anymore. So I don't know. There's definitely some reasons for it. People aren't so guided by their instincts anymore for the worse in the long run, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it's funny because like this, we'll get to the work of art, but in terms of like the individual subject, Spengler talks about how there still will be people on the end stages of civilization in terms of how reason, to use a Deleuzean term, reason overcodes itself. And there's, to me, I mean, writing my book currently on a neoliberal kitsch, I have this whole big chapter on Spengler, and that's why I wanted to bring you on, because I'm like, well, I'm doing a lot of Spengler research, so it's perfect time that I need to talk to SA. But I noticed that there is this through line between even like a more of a Marxist, let's say Theodor Adorno, Horkheimer analysis of instrumental reason, and of course Heidegger. And you explained this once in a Twitter space about how Heidegger was actually a reader of Spengler. And I think I don't know if they had any communication, but certainly this critique of instrumental reason is apt. But Spengler said that there will be people that, correct me if I'm wrong, but there will be still people that have this sort of romanticist ideal or still want to cling to nature. The work of art's full of this. In modernism, you have like Gauguin and to an extent Picasso, and then later people like Mark Tobey that want to reconnect to sort of a picture of vitalistic nature. But I think that the sensitive young man is probably because like when I see like a lot of the anime posters that talk about love and romance, and they talk about how there is this lack of a grand narrative. I think that's why they love anime. And I think that's why like people can't understand it, because the sort of romanticism between men and women that are offered by the certain higher brow forms of anime and manga. I mean maybe we're just intellectualizing it here, but there's a grandness to it that was unique to the Western spirit, but now that has sort of soured over. A lot of like millennial 2010s, what does my friend Catherine D call it? Like 2010 sexuality. A lot of that was just, we're still living in like sort of the radiation of it, but yeah, go ahead, Spergler. What do you think of my analysis there?
This is interesting. Did Spengler predict the anime waifus? I don't know.
Maybe.
On the question of nature, that is an interesting point. One of the things that Spengler says kind of indicates some sort of transition. So in Spengler, I guess I should say for the audience, there's what Spengler is doing is kind of an analysis of the development or the archetype really of a culture.
Yes.
And essentially it goes from almost like a pre-rational intuitive basis, and it usually is developing some sort of aesthetic idea, and it's manifest in all of its art, its mathematics, its architecture, its philosophy, and so on. And once it kind of actualizes this inherent idea within it, there's just not really a whole lot left to do in that culture. And consequently, things slow down, productions of great art essentially drop off the map, and eventually the culture dies. One of the distinctions that Spengler makes is the distinction between Kultur, or just culture, and Zivilisation, right? Civilization. And essentially, the difference there is between the organic and the inorganic. So when a culture is still young, it's still organic, it's still producing. For Spengler, it's still becoming. He has this dichotomy between becoming versus the become. And once an idea is kind of apotheosized within its art or within its philosophy, it reaches its apex. It reaches the become. But once you hit that, there's just, again, not a whole lot left to do. And one of the things that Spengler says kind of indicates that transition from culture to civilization. There's a few things. So he says there's like the Socratic man who comes in and begins to rationalize like all the older culture forms. So, you know, think of Socrates and how his dialogues.
Nietzsche's critique of Socrates. Yeah,
exactly. That's one of the big things that Spengler takes from Nietzsche is this idea of the Socratic man that you see in the birth of tragedy, and then also the beginning of I can't remember if it's the Antichrist or if it's the Twilight of the Idols. I think it's Twilight of the Idols.
Twilight of the Idols, yes. Yeah. Socrates specifically. Yeah.
So think of how Socrates is portrayed in Plato's dialogues, right? So Socrates, being an annoying little bat, comes up to some random little Greek guys and says, "So what is justice? Like, what do you think justice is?" And you know, whoever he's asking,
what do you think
would just
justice
kind of
is? You would think that people would tell us. Our producers asked the lawgivers.
Yeah. Tucker Carlson, is he a Socratic man? I don't know. But, you know, doubtless some Greek would just kind of prattle on about whatever, you know, folk wisdom he had been given about what justice is. And then Socrates would just tear it to shreds, right? That's literally the dissolution of older culture forms. You know, innate ideas of like what our culture says justice is or what beauty is. Socrates just comes in and he doesn't even offer any real answers, right? Everything ends in aporia, right?
Aporia.
Some sort of, exactly, like disagreement, uncertainty, kind of like a standstill. There's no actual production of getting somewhere new. It's just constant disagreement and uncertainty. And that's the dissolution of older culture forms. And at least in the West, so Spengler says that a cult of nature kind of crops up as a result of this in a lot of different places, or all like the different major cultures or civilizations. So the Socratic men that he kind of points out, so it's Buddha for the Indians, it's Socrates obviously for the Greeks. He says it's Rousseau for the modern Faustian West. That's also an important point for your listeners. Spengler says that the Greco-Roman civilization is different from the modern Western European civilization. That one is characterized by this Apollonian ideal, while the other is characterized by a Faustian striving. And you know, one of the things that Rousseau does is this kind of call back to nature, to say that our culture, our society is, we live in a society. Rousseau is the original "we live in a society," right? He's problematizing it, and he's like wanting to go back to nature with his kind of thought experiment of like of man in the state of nature. Even though we know now it's just complete fantasy. It's not
even the
actually
general
how
will.
it worked.
Yeah, even the general will of Rousseau. When I was in grad school, these were questions having to relitigate in political philosophy. But even like the general will is sort of like a capitulation of the way that tribal societies were to sort out their own, how shall I call it? Their own nomos, if you will. Like, you know, in Egypt, they had Mahat. The Greeks had nomos, like their own set of law that is in some ways like a collective unconscious that instantiates the rule. But of course, like the way that the sort of like stick way that Rousseau like goes about it, about the general will, And of course, people read proto-Marxism into it as well. But yeah, go ahead. That's a diversion. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's actually an interesting thing to bring up, that distinction between nomos, which for the Greeks kind of just means like law or custom. It's
Yeah.
something that like a social structure will kind of institute, but isn't necessarily natural. And that's compared against phusis, right? Which is kind of understood as just like actual nature. And there's kind of like this return to actual nature because we no longer have any sort of firm grounding for nomos to stand, right? Like the
Right.
Socratic man, he kind of deracinates, if we want to use the Ryan Gosling term. I love those edits, by the way, of all the Ryan Gosling stuff.
From The
But
Believer. Yeah.
yeah,
He
yeah.
deracinates. Write it down. Deracinates. A person drives the G's from the land.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. I reviewed it
I
with
need to-
Prude, by the way. That's why I keep yeah.
I need to make some sort of edit of that about Ryan Gosling complaining about the Socratic man and his deracinating. That would be fun. There's a lot of meme opportunities with the Spengler stuff. So
Oh yeah.
but right, he deracinates like the you know, I don't, is it nomad? No, not nomadic. I don't know what like the adjective is for nomos. He gets rid of the nomos, right? He kind of shreds it to bits. And what do you have left other than just kind of a return back to the frightening nature? And that's just the issue with Rousseau, is that he just didn't quite understand nature.
Yeah. Well, that's what Spengler said. It's like man will return to the soil. In the chapter of my book, which hopefully you'll get to read maybe next year. I talk about how, and it talked about the second religiousness as well, how man returning to the soil in a way is sort of like nowadays we're reenacting this, like, I would say primitive form of atomization, but in like a high-tech society. Sexuality and sexual mores being like totally detached from what they were. Like that's one example. The artwork that is accompanied by our current civilization, which I call neoliberal kitsch, is like an example of this returning to the earth, returning. I mean, even the whole mania over environmentalism and this sort of existential threat of environmental catastrophe. I hate that word, by the way, because it comes from like bugmen philosophers like Nick Bostrom. But existential security is like this total annihilation via this like primitive earth worship. Is quite interesting how in like the digital civilization that we're living in, how this like returns back to form. But yeah, so I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just butchering the whole concept of Spengler, but what do you think of this?
Thomas Kincaid is the future. That's I really think,
yeah.
I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of, I don't know, it's like almost like a feverish, like there's a way in which you can kind of look at like a Thomas Kincaid painting and it not be kitsch, but almost be like nightmarish. Like,
Yeah.
imagine if like that was the world that we actually lived in. It's just so like incongruent to the world that we live in. It would almost like feel like all this like overt sentimental beneficence in the art is actually under, it's covering something very dark. Like imagine going into the forest behind the nice Kincaid painting of a cabin, like what sort of monsters you would actually see. And that's I don't know.
It's like that movie.
There's something dark in the art.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but even like when you talk about the gadfly of reason and Spengler taking from Nietzsche, it's almost like when Nietzsche says about the what dialogue was it? It may have been the Protagoras, where by the time you get to the Socrates as a character of Plato, now you have the sort of imparting of this detached from nature form of reason by Plato. So, for example, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, if it's not the Protagoras, it was some other dialogue where they're talking about mathematics, and Plato's character Socrates says, well, everyone can get it. Like, look at the slave boy. And there's this whole like academic literature around the slave boy in Socratic studies. But he asks the slave boy this complex mathematical question, and the slave boy gets it. And it's like this demonstration of Plato that it's like, well, see, everyone can get this like source of originary reason and like the form of reason is imparted into everybody. And of course, Nietzsche's like, well, no, actually, if it was actually ancient Greece, because Nietzsche being a philologist, he's like, if this was real, if this was actually ancient Greece, I don't think a serf boy would get access to like advanced Pythagorean mathematical education. I don't know if that's true or not. Like that's
Well, yeah, that's the Meno dialogue or the Meno.
The Meno,
I don't
yeah,
know
the
how to
Meno,
pronounce.
yeah.
Yeah. So the idea there being that there's some sort of remembering, right? For Plato, knowledge is something that you kind of remember based off of like your past lives, or it's like a harkening back to what the soul already knows. I mean, so that sense, it's already something intuitive. And perhaps we could even say that it's not something that is just a product of culture. It's, there's like the Platonic ideal out there, or whatever, Platonic knowledge out there, wherever out there is, right? And you can kind of access it. I guess in some ways that is like a kind of phusis, some sort of like callback to, base nature. But then always the question is like whether or not they actually correctly ascertained like what base nature is. And obviously people like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer would say, no, they did not get it correctly, that, base nature is perhaps the will, and there's this inherent struggle and warring going on. And Spengler will, give his own 2 cents on it at some point, saying that that's just how Faustian man or Western man perceives it. And each, culture has its own sense of being that differs from the others. And consequently, you have very different metaphysics that emerge within each culture.
Yes, exactly. And also I think to go back a little bit, because I want to ask you about Spengler and multiculturalism, which I might have to paywall. But you talked about how the original creation of civilization, rather a culture that reaches its apex in a civilization in a unified form. Spengler talks about the form of the formless. What is Spengler's theory of the creation of that? Now, I know he talks about the great man, but it seems that Spengler, the reason that modern academia and modern history departments discard him, because, well, just for the fact that he's a grand thinker on almost a metaphysical level, but also like his view of history is incredibly verboten in terms of what creates that civilization, what wrestles what he calls like the energies of nature into being. Because nowadays it's like there's no more great man. It's like what did the peasantry do? What did the towel boy, the Roman towel boy, what did they do? That's what really matters in history departments nowadays, right? Mary Beard talking about how Rome was like the first Canadian multicultural model of civilization.
Yeah, apparently there were a lot of African guards in Britain. I didn't know this. Thank you, Mary Beard. Very useful.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess your question. Could you just like say your question again, just more?
What is Spengler's theory of the creation of civilization? Who does it, or what does it? Yeah.
So, here's the thing with Spengler. So, Spengler, he creates this sort of, I guess, opposition of mind, that there are different faculties at play in order to understand 2 very different things. So, on the one hand, you have systems, you have laws, you have causality. On the other hand, you have more of these artistic ideas, these flashing images, and you don't have laws, but you have, what's the term he uses? You kind of have these analogies in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Spengler, in the early part of Volume 1 of Decline of the West, he's creating this opposition between the physiognomist versus the systematist. And there's 2 very different, again, things at play here. On the one hand, you have, he's trying to kind of ascertain like the inner character of certain cultures and civilizations, while the systematist is trying to create like these causal laws. So when we speak of like what causes like a culture to be born, Spengler is going to say, you can't actually operate under this principle of causality in order to understand what I'm really getting at, that there are no sort of causes. Things just kind of happen in a certain way. And it's not to say that there aren't necessarily causes, but it's just not what Spengler's interested in. So like, let's one of the things that Spengler is doing in Decline of the West is he's relying on Goethe's work on plant morphology.
Yes.
And
Yes.
for plant morphology, if you look at what Goethe is saying, he's not interested in like, oh, what causes the plant to grow. He doesn't care about that. What he's really interested in is the different developmental stages that all plants go through. To say that, you know, all plants go through a roughly analogous life cycle, and we can kind of ascertain this inner character of the, you know, the archetypal, you know, course of a plant's growth. Spengler's doing the exact same thing. He's just interested in that.
Yeah.
But you still do get some sort of sense of what it is that kind of precipitates a culture's birth. So partly it's the geography from which it comes. So Spengler, he says that cultures are like plants that are rooted in a particular soil, into which that soil they remain their entire lives. And the local geography essentially dictates the culture's sense of aesthetics, its sense of space, its sense of time. Oh, yes. For the West, it was born in the dark and brooding forests of Germany and Western Europe broadly. And this is where we get the birth of kind of like the Gothic. So you think of like the Black Forest in Germany and kind of like the Grimm brothers fairy tales and all of that. Extremely dark, extremely brooding. And you look up at the canopy of these tall trees and these ancient forests, and you see that sense of verticality right above you. And that's where
we have a striving to go up. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That striving vertical tendency is innate in the modern West. You contrast this to all the other different cultures. You know, Spengler says that for Greco-Roman civilization or culture, that its local geography was the Greek archipelagos, all these tiny little bodies or islands kind of strewn about in the Aegean. And consequently, you get a certain world feeling, a certain, I don't want to get into the soul image stuff, but yeah, a certain world feeling of the body in nearby space, that because it was kind of born in that particular geography, that's going to be the central idea that it's working out for the rest of its history.
Right.
And you definitely see that on full display. You know, the Greeks were obsessed with the body in a lot of ways. Obviously, Spengler, he's arguing that for Greek art, it really hit its apotheosis with the sculptors and the golden age of Athenian sculptors, people like Phidias and Myron and the likes, with the Polycletus statue especially. So that's really, I guess, I hope that answers the question. Just kind of like, it's like the local geography. There's also this element of death anxiety. So, you know, Spengler, he's likening these cultures also to humans. And you think of like a young child who's born, who's having like night terrors and nightmares. And you see that as well with an early culture. Like think about some of the art from the early Faustian West. You can think of, gosh, his name's escaping me, but the one who does like all those like nightmarish hellscapes, Hieronymus Bosch. Yeah. You think of his art, and it's a nightmare, right? That's kind of indicative of a earlier culture. And you think of some of like the older, you know, things that were being worked out with in like the 900s and around 1000 AD, which is like the real birth of the Faustian West. It's complete mythologies, mythical. The mythical conscious structure is still very much at play. There's, you know, monsters and dragons and knights and the Holy Grail, all sorts of just like mythologizing at play. It's it's a sort of imagination that a young child has, but an old man does not.
Yes, exactly. And also there's some inkling of great man in there that become, you know, the legacy of a great man lives on through their infamy in a way, their creation, their spirit. It's like their own, I guess I remember Bap talking about this with the ancient Greek ideal of like how a great man lives on, and almost like a proto form of celebritydom, but it's something that becomes mythologized over time. You know, and of course you could trace this back to Nietzsche, but that's very interesting because that grates with a lot of like modern, I mean, what do like the modern history departments, what do they feel about the creation of civilization? That it's like this like mushy liberal ideas based thing that is like rationalized into existence. Um, I mean, and also like why has Spengler been so kicked out of even study in like let alone history departments, but also like even just culture studies and philosophy and so forth. Yeah, I mean, apart from him, well, apart from the connotations with the far right, but apart from that,
Yeah, it's a good question. So first, as to like what modern academics say about like the development of complex societies, I don't really know. I don't pay attention to them enough. I mean, I would assume they would just say something stupid like it's born out of some sort of like economic like necessity, like
hmm
some sort of like argument of like specialization and it improving lives. I guess in a lot of ways it's like very it's like Adam Smith, right? Everyone needs to like specialize and then trade. It's very
yeah,
capitalist in a lot of ways. But I can't say that with certainty because I don't even know if anybody even writes like on this sort of level. I mean, I guess like you got who's like Yuval Noah Harari who's
oh
trying to
yes, yeah,
yeah, well, if that's our our modern historian of civilization, then that says a lot about where we are. Uh, you know, ancient Persia was created to eat the bugs. We had to eat the bugs, or India was created to eat the bugs. Like
yeah,
we had too many bugs and we needed to eat them more efficiently. So we had to create civilization. I'm sure that's something Yuval Noah Harari would argue. Okay.
exactly, yeah,
WEF guy. Now, well, so, okay. Then why academics don't like Spengler?
yes,
So the issue with Spengler, this goes back to this question of causality versus the physiognomist.
right,
For Spengler, all this it's kind of like it's art criticism in a lot of ways. It's
oh, very
judgment.
much so,
There's no sort of very rigorous and methodical approach you can take. A lot of this is just based on intuition. That when you see a a Western painting, that you can kind of intuit certain characteristics of it, and that you can kind of create some sort of synthesis in your mind about how it connects to the rest of the art. He's kind of creating these judgments, and he's drawing the line in the sand in a particular way. But there's no like real way to necessarily agree or I mean, you can agree or disagree, but there's no way to kind of definitively prove, right? So if you say like, oh, Spengler, he's saying that he's judging certain aspects of when you think of an example, let's just say like you look at like Western painting, right? And Spengler's making the argument that there's something very unique going on with the West, that it's the first civilization to create really this emphasis on perspectivism, right? A
right,
vanishing point, these lines that seemingly can extrapolate into the infinite. That's like I mean, I guess you can kind of prove it, but what it really comes down to is some sort of like a judgment. Like when I see the painting, I can kind of agree with that. Like, oh yeah, I see exactly what Spengler's talking about. And then I can also notice like, oh, these other civilizations, when I look at their art, doesn't have that. I don't see that.
right,
But like that's like the sort of thing that academics really like, especially those of like history departments in philosophy. I think maybe more of like the art criticism people would be kind of open to it because they're not,
oh yeah,
they don't have a stick as far up their ass. But that's part of it. A lot of people complaining that Spengler did not correctly ascertain the prime symbol of each of these cultures, like their inherent symbolism. Others would go about saying, oh, but we have these examples that indicate some sort of different symbolism at play. And because Spengler would say that this is a part of the West, but there's a discrepancy here,
oh
therefore
yeah,
Spengler's whole idea is completely wrong, which is like a very, it's very pettifogging. You're kind of losing the whole forest by focusing on the one tree. So
it's very much like Black Swan, like petty, like oh, this counterexample is like in this,
exactly.
yeah, yeah. There was
Yeah.
one black man in medieval Britain, and therefore, uh,
Therefore, Mary Beard is completely right, and we have to buy her books.
yeah, exactly. Because no, but it is funny though because when I studied for years, a lot of art from the East, a lot of literati painting, and there is a degree of infinite space that is there, but there's a totally different purpose to the, the Chinese and Japanese sumi ink paintings in terms of the perspective and the depth of it than, say, the full presence of being you get in Western painting, where three-dimensionality is like everything until you get up to the Impressionists. But they have a different form of depth and perspective that in some ways, of course, was influenced by the East with Happonism, and they were, getting various woodcuts, ukiyo woodcuts from Japan and so forth. But yeah, but so to go along this, it's, I guess, Spengler, of course, he isn't like Nietzsche. He's not like this, grand history. He doesn't purport like a historiography that is exactly like succinct and contained within its own world. It's very much like he cross cuts through a lot of distinctions. But how would you get to what really crystallizes Faustian man to Spengler in Decline of the West? Like, he's obviously pro-Germanic, but he's not. He doesn't discard the sort of the influence of the Mediterranean, my peoples, but he very much is saying that Faustian man specifically comes from like this sort of Northern European Germanic influence, or yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that Spengler talks a lot about in Volume 1 of Decline of the West is he's trying to undo a certain historical schema. He says the ancient medieval modern schema in which we see this continuation of themes and ideas from classical antiquity, Greco-Roman civilization, through the medieval period, and then kind of a rebirth in the Renaissance, and then that somehow also influences what we see today. Spengler, he's tearing that entire idea to shreds. He wants to separate all those things out into completely different things. So Spengler is saying that, for him, like what really defines a culture is the birth of a new idea that is, again, manifested in all of its productions: art, history, or art, philosophy, mathematics, architecture, etc. And insofar as you can ascertain a new sort of prime symbol, thereof there is a new culture. So you're completely right in saying that Spengler sees the modern Faustian West as something separate from Greco-Roman civilization. Whereof the Greco-Roman civilization is really birthed in the Mediterranean. The Germanics are really the ones kind of leading Faustian civilization, where it really gets going. Again, in the dark and brooding forests of Germany. And that's really what characterizes Faustian man for Spengler, this yearning for the infinite that you see in these tall trees. Although I would add there's also a Norse element to it. You think of like a Norseman, sailing out into the ocean, seeing these vast fjords and the infinite sea in front of you. And that also has to just be some part of the Faustian man's experience of space. Extreme horizons of the infinite, extreme depth. Like, just think about the sort of sense of space and air, the mist inside of a fjord that you might see. It's extremely powerful. And it's not something you get in like a more southern Mediterranean climate. And consequently, again, there's a lot of broodiness. And if you don't mind, I can actually read
go ahead.
a little bit, trying to see. So I think this is where Spengler, he's talking about kind of the difference between, let's see, I want to make sure I have this correct. Yes, I do. The difference between kind of a Homeric sense of the individual a Greek sense of the individual versus what the Faustian West sees. And for the Faustian West, that's the most important thing, the individual. So it's the individual point in infinite space, the sense of infinite smallness in this broader context of the infinitely large. Now I'm reading here. The accents.
Are you reading?
Yeah, I'm reading now. The accents of the Homeric hexameter are the soft rustle of a leaf in the midday sun, the rhythm of matter. But the Stabraim, sorry, I don't know any German, like potential energy in the world pictures of modern physics, create a tense restraint in the void without limit. Distant night storms above the high peaks. In its swaying without limits, in its swaying indefiniteness, all words and things dissolve themselves. It is the dynamics, not the statics, of language. The same applies to the grave rhythm of Media Vita in Morte Sumus. Here is heralded the color of Rembrandt in the instrumentation of Beethoven. Here, infinite solitude is felt as the home of the Faustian soul. And then he goes on. Lost in the limitless, it appears with its inharmonious gods and heroes, the supreme symbol of solitude. Siegfried, Parzival, Tristan, Hamlet, and Faust are the loneliest heroes in all the cultures. Read the wondrous awakening of the inner life in Wolfram's Parzival, the longing for the woods, the mysterious compassion, the ineffable sense of forsakenness. It is all Faustian and only Faustian. Every one of us knows it. The motive returns with all its profundity in the Easter scene of Faust I. A longing pure and not to be described drove me to wander over woods and fields, and in a mist of hot, abundant tears, I felt a world arise and live for me. Wow. So that's Spengler in Volume 1, Decline of the West. That sense of the Faustian loneliness. You know, yes. I love that line so much. Faustian man is the loneliest of all of the world's cultures. And I think it's very true. Another thing that Spengler says is that Faustian man feels most at home or like himself in the dead of night, while Greco-Roman man or Greeks, they feel most like themselves at midday, at noon, high sun. It's just very different world feelings. That's one of the things that Spengler's also trying to do all throughout this, is show how different Faustian and classical man are.
Yes.
So,
no, yeah. But that plays into everything. I mean, Mediterranean art, the sensuousness of color, like how the crowdedness of, say, a Raphael, or even, I mean, you get inklings of Faustian art in Titian, right? His portraits of Christ, for instance, but very much different than the Germanic High Renaissance, when you have, like, you know, Bruegel, you know, Rembrandt. By the time you get to Rembrandt, you have the sort of the full contextualization of the portrait, the singular portrait, the way that he approaches texture is very, very different. And then, you know, further north, by the time you get to the, you know, the modernists and Edvard Munch, you have this very stark and dour, individualistic type of artwork that can be somewhat alien to the Mediterranean spirit, that's, you know, filled with this sort of sensuousness and celebration of beauty. I mean, there's crossovers as well. There's always going to be those examples. Poussin, for instance, is one of them, where man directly is emerged within nature, but also still has the crowd that becomes nature. And so Poussin's like a very crossover type of artist. But yeah, but that's amazing. One point you were talking about, rather, the quote from Spengler that talks about the Germanic hero being, you know, walking alone. I don't know if we started this discussion talking about anime, but could that be why in the West there is this popularity of shonen mangas, where it's like, you know, the hero that goes on a lonely hero's journey? I mean, I wonder if this is, you know, Faustian spirit trying to manifest itself once again, but now in the East, because if there's like the sort of similarities between the, you know, the Japanese experience and the Germanic experience, I wonder if there's still there's some weird crossover there. I wonder.
Indeed, there is. Okay, so Spengler's most well known for his book, The Decline of the West, but he wrote a few other books, including one that was going to be this great. Honestly, it might have been even better than Decline of the West. It was going to be, I forget the exact title in English. So it's Early Days of World History. And one of the things that he says there, and also in another book, but it's that there's this melancholic world feeling that stretches from the Nordics all across to Japan, you know, through the Arctic, this melancholic world feeling. And later on in that book on the Early Days of World History, he was kind of getting at this idea of a pre-cultural period, which he calls like Tehran, and that there was this kind of, you can kind of think of like Nietzsche's Blonde Beast, like the Aryan steppe hero that kind of like wandered all around that area.
That
think of like
just explores space and conquers space and
yes,
does what thou will. Yes, yes.
it's the kind of the proto-Indo-European in a lot of ways, kind of conquering the steppe in a lot of ways, just going everywhere. And he kind of brings with him that the sort of individualistic cult of the individual hero, and a melancholic world feeling as well. And I think he specifically says that it's more into the north, right? The Nordics, the Arctic Circle in Japan, possibly because of like the weather, right? You get more of
Yes.
like a melancholic feeling. That sort of ambient environment is going to in some way influence your disposition. And so yeah, there's this weird connection that he does make to Japan. It's actually one of like the very few places where he talks about Japan. He really doesn't get into Japan all that much in his writing, unfortunately. But regarding the anime thing, so here's one way of looking at it. 1 second. Okay, no. So I have very bad internet, so I thought it cut out for a second, but I think we're good. So one of the things he says about anime, or he does not talk about anime. Sorry, one of the things that we can say about one of the things that we can say about anime.
We've reincarnated him, and now he's talking about anime. So
well, I don't. Maybe we don't need to get into this, but there is somebody who's been experimenting with radical means of communication with Oswald Spengler's ghost.
Yes, of course.
Are you familiar with this?
Oh, yes, I'm very familiar with what you're about to say. Go ahead.
Okay, well, there is this man. He's been in the news lately. He's controversial. So I'll just say it's John David Ebert. He's obviously well known for his series on Decline of the West and art in general. But in the last few years, he's had a serious interest with mediums and talking to the dead. And he's interviewed Spengler's spirit through his medium, Shruti Campbell. Maybe we can hire her services, and then we can also get him on the next episode of your podcast. Get Spengler's ghost on here. I don't know.
We'll make him. We'll tell him to read. He's probably already read Berserk from the 80s. So, we could talk to him about Berserk. That's probably
But let's look at this through a Spenglerian lens. So one of the things that Spengler says can occur is this process called pseudomorphosis.
Yes.
So what a pseudomorphosis is, it's a geological term from like mineralogy. So when you have a kind of a crystal or whatever develop like in the ground, it'll have a certain shape, right? And let's just say for whatever reason, the crystal or the rock inside that space, it kind of dissolves. So what you have is kind of like this empty space that exhibits the natural crystalline structure of whatever came before it. And then what happens is that you can get the birth of something new inside of that space. Like you'll get, I don't really know my minerals, but let's just say you get like I don't know,
certain
like an emerald
gemstones,
an emerald or something that's like growing inside the space where previously there was like a bunch of quartz. So what happens is like that emerald will take on this unnatural shape of the quartz that came before it. And Spengler says the exact same thing can happen with a culture, that essentially if you have a very big and overpowering culture that's extremely strong, and he says like the Greco-Romans were extremely strong and that they kind of overshadowed a lot of other cultures, that the Magian culture, which we can kind of think of as like a combination of the Byzantines, of the Arabs, the early Christians, that kind of sort of Middle Eastern world of early Christianity and of Islam, that it grew up inside the space left by classical civilization. And therefore, there were a lot of unnatural elements to it that had to kind of work itself out. It took a long time. You think of the Byzantine, the outward forms of like something like the Byzantine Empire. They still had like a lot of quote unquote like Romanness to it, but you look at its art, you look at its religion, very alien to the classical world. So that's one
to
thing.
classical Greek, Greek and Roman paganism, especially. Yes,
exactly. Yes, and especially the art. You think of how different it was. Like they weren't doing the plastic arts or statues. They were obsessed with like these not frescoes. Are they frescoes? Like all the paintings like in the domes. You think of like the Hagia Sophia and all the iconography.
A lot of them are frescoes. A lot of them later on use tempera. Yeah, more or less fresco is still carried over, if I recall. Yes.
Yeah. So fresco is, I guess, carried over from the classical, but even Spengler says what the classical really wants to do with fresco is to like take the individuals in the fresco out and
Yes.
actualize them as as an actual body, which you obviously see with statues. And so that idea of pseudomorphosis, that's one thing. And Spengler also says, in particular for Japan, he calls it a moonlight civilization.
Mm.
So what that means, uh, so the moon does not create its own light, obviously.
It reflects.
But
Yes.
exactly, it reflects the light of something greater, the sun, in the case of the moon. And Spengler says a moonlight civilization is essentially like a kind of like a cultural reflector. And for so long, Japan was just reflecting the light of China. That
Yes.
so much of what was going on in Japan was just the reflection of the Chinese.
Well, even
And
literati painting, even Buddhism as well. Chan Buddhism then goes to Zen. Yes. Yeah.
yes, yes. But what happens in the process of Japanese modernization is it tries to kind of free itself from being like a moonlight civilization. It wants
Oh
to,
boy, did they try? Yeah,
yeah,
did they
they
ever? Yeah.
exactly. But the irony there is that even in the process of modernizing, they didn't actually stop being a moonlight civilization. It's just they looked to a different source of light. Instead of looking to
Mm.
China, they looked to the West. They adopted all these Western forms of politics. They were, engaged with like Western ideas. Everybody was like reading like Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism. They were obsessed with Western learning and Western techniques. You think of like those, what are they, like the Dutch studies in Japan, like all those like little Dutch port towns in the
Oh
south of
yes.
Japan, where they were getting all this like Western information. So you just see the moonlight civilization. It goes from China to the West.
They love
And
French
that's,
architecture and French art as well. Yes.
and this is all a long way of saying that that's anime, right? It's,
Yes,
the,
that's
the, the
correct.
Japanese, they've gone from, the Chinese to looking at the Chinese to looking at the West. And that's like why we see this sort of spiritual harmony, I guess, between the Faustian man and his brooding loneliness, and then what we see reflected in Japanese art. In some sense, it's Faustian art that's being transformed through this Japanese like Snapchat filter in some ways, you know?
Yeah, because anime was the creation of a lot of the indigenous styles and presentations in Japan, whether it be no theater, a lot of the characterization that's very abstract and vague that comes from originally from China. Then you get these like chibi characters, and by the time you get to Kabuki theater, which itself was this mix of like Western art and in Japanese sensibilities, it becomes like this sort of cosmopolitan theater, right? That was an abstraction from no theater. Anime comes along from like Western animation and mixed in with these Japanese sensibilities, and there's this constant theme. Even I people know I love talking about this. Even professional wrestling in Japan, strong style, purisu, is a mix of like Southern wrestling from America and a lot of technical wrestling from Britain, from these people like Billy Robinson that went over, um, from Australia and Britain. And of course, Antonio Inoki takes it and takes these indigenous fighting styles in Japan from judo and so forth and creates this like weird eclecticism that then creates both Japanese professional wrestling and mixed martial arts. So yeah, I mean that's totally will be another example of a moonlight civilization. I know some people, like for example, our really good friend Logo Atlas has this view of China being the perfection of American republicanism. That's sort of they read the founding fathers there, so therefore Xi Jinping is going to be the real Alexander Hamilton 2.0. Do you subscribe to the Spergler?
No, I think MacArthur had the right idea. We should have launched the nukes, but no,
Oh boy.
I completely disagree. I think if you look at like what modern China is, there's certainly a break in continuity with like the ancient empires, right?
Yes.
But I don't even think China, the way we think of China, has existed for so long. It's not just like the downfall of the Qing dynasty. By the time of like the Qing dynasty, it was like these Manchu war people wearing like the skin suit of like Confucian China.
Yeah.
I I've used this example in the past. I don't know how well it holds, but when we think of the ancient Egyptians, do we like at all say that there's some sort of like civilizational continuity between who the ancient Egyptians were and modern Egyptians? No,
Oh God,
because
no.
it would be ridiculous, right?
Right.
But for whatever reason, China gets a pass, and we see some sort of like 3,000-year-old continuous civilization with like unchanging values. I think that's very silly in terms of historiography. But at least with the advent of kind of like a secular Chinese state with the nationalists and then the communists, we do see some sort of break. But so much of like what Chinese history has become is some sort of like attempt to show the unchanging, to show the continuation rather than the change.
Well,
And
yeah, even the creation of the Han and the conception of Mao is like this. He knew he had to create like a, the Communist Party to create this grand mythos of the Chinese people. Yeah, go ahead, Spectre. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's all invented. It's all fake. The Han identity, with like every couple of decades, it grows larger and larger and assimilates, different people. The Han is, it's like Bap says, it's like the Borg. It just like grows and assimilates, and it's not an organic category whatsoever. I don't know, regarding China, some sort of like authentic American republicanism. I don't know. For me, it's kind of hard to say that China really ever got out of its kind of like Caesarist emperor phase. Like I think in a lot of ways it's just the continuity, or the reverting back to some sort of like just strongman government. You had like I guess like a brief interregnum with like all like the turbulence of after the Qing dynasty, and then like the Chinese Civil War, and then the Japanese invading. But I mean, between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping, it seems like it's just, back to emperor worship in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're really, I don't know, if you ask them, I guess like they're good old communists in the CCP. I don't know. It's complicated. There's a lot of, I guess, different ways to look at it. Whether they're, LARPing as Alexander Hamilton, I don't know. I don't think so. I think that they have a very particular identity. It's communism or socialism with like Chinese characteristics. They're trying to square the circle in a lot of ways.
So you're saying that Logodialis is not the greatest living sinologist of our time. Is that what you're trying to tell me here?
I'm saying there's a reason why I don't follow him on Twitter.
Okay. Yeah. I know I have to chat him, but no, but interesting point would be that another example of a moonlight civilization, but also like when it comes to China, like you were saying, the strongman hero worship, but it does seem that like geopolitically, the West has sort of outsourced its own capacity to reproduce itself in terms of manufacturing and consumer capitalism, that Faustian man has overcoded itself to such a degree that now we have to rely on like the outside. We have to sort of like deterritorialize our own space of economism towards the east. And I wonder if there's some kind of poetry or some kind of like dark fruition within that. It's very interesting how that turned out when it comes to China, but yeah.
So in Spengler, he also wrote a little, I don't know if you call it an essay. Let's just call it a booklet called Man and Technics. Very short, very accessible. It's actually the book I recommend to people if they want to read Spengler for the first time, because it's so short and it gets at some of Spengler's ideas. And in there, the whole book is about the advent of technology and how technology has been specifically important for the Faustian man. It allows him to manipulate the world around him in a way that we don't see. Again, one of the hallmarks of Faustian man is just striving for the infinite, to control all things, and technology has really just become a vessel for that.
Yes.
What Spengler is lamenting in his age is he's seeing the way in which European imperialism is basically planting the seeds of its own destruction. because you're seeing this diffusion of Western technology to the third world. At some point in the essay or the booklet, he's complaining about all these Western captains of industry who are teaching, the Chinese and the Japanese how to build these factories and how to create these machines just to make a quick buck. Because you're basically handing them the keys to the kingdom in a lot of ways, or the genie's now out of the bottle, and you're going to basically give them the means to revolt in the long run.
Wasn't that prophetic?
It very much was, and that completely right. And he predicted essentially what would go on in the 50s and 60s with decolonization in Africa and Asia. Completely bang on the money. And all of these decolonization and anti-colonialist movements, very few of them, if any, were based on some sort of complete reversion back to ancient tradition.
Oh God!
All of them were based on this idea of synthesis. It's this a perennial question of changing continuity. How do we preserve some sort of authentic traditional civilizational identity while also using Western ideas of technology, politics, and warfare?
Well, this was Franz Fanon, the Wretched of the Earth, par excellence.
Yes.
Right? Yes.
Yeah. Use the West to beat the West is essentially what it boiled down to. And Spengler is completely right. We should never have given them the machines, and Western man lost his global hegemony. But now it still is maintained in this kind of weird, economic structure in which the dollar is propped up. And I don't know
the
if
liberal rules-based order, quote unquote.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But of course, now it's funny how the West is annexing itself and its own identity for this very nebulous post-history, post-civilization state, like the global homogenous state, and how that's sort of, and you could even read Kojev into this, how that's very interesting how, Western Faustian man is extrapolated and, how should I put it, eminentized its own eschatology to such an extent that Western man is now a non-category, is now a non-people in a non-place, that most people in the West don't even think of themselves as living in a unique civilization, but rather maybe perhaps a unique sense of order. It just reminds me of all that discourse from the before 2010s, the Mark Steins and the Charles Murray's, not Charles Murray, the other Murray, what's his name? Oh, the British guy.
Oh, Douglas Murray?
Douglas Murray, yeah, all those, what is Western values against Islam? It's I don't know, freedom and gay marriage or something,
Yes. Liberalism is when Douglas Murray can drive into a sketchy part of a city and give a little $10 this or a little $20 that to the down low brothers, but I don't need to put him on blast for his appetite. But you see definitely the sort of discourse about no man, I'm just a citizen of the world or whatever. This sort of extreme cosmopolitan identity that in some ways it is kind of natural for this quote unquote stage of the civilization. I'm sure that the Romans, they had this idea of of their imperium kind of extending throughout their empire. It was cosmopolitan in a lot of ways. They were also able to, gain the loyalty of many disparate peoples. I think it's also an idea that starts with, I'm forgetting the exact Latin phrase, but it's also an idea that starts with Alexander the Great's empire. Maybe I'll Google it later, but there is a cosmopolitan element, but the issue is we have the cosmopolitan values without the actual political control over the world in which it would actually make sense.
Exactly. Yeah. No, but that's a great point though. And geopolitically, we could see this nowadays. We'll talk a little bit later about the Russia situation and Spengler's writings on Russia. But I guess now is as good a time as any to talk about the work of art. How did Spengler see the overtoppling? And by the way, shout out to, I was talking a little bit about it with him, but my good friend Fen de Villiers, he'll love this. how did Spengler see painting becoming the capstone of the artwork, of the sort of arrangement of the plastic arts in Western civilization? How was sculpture overcome, and how did sculpture lose its meaning? Even though sculpture persists, how did it lose its hold upon the Western imagination, or rather classical imagination going into Western imagination? How did that happen in Spengler's analysis?
Okay, so first it should be said that for Spengler, the painting probably isn't the apotheosis of Western art. It's really music for Spengler.
Music, yeah, yeah.
But there is still like that element of overcoming the classical.
Yes.
So as you said, if we say that the apotheosis of classical art is to be found in the statues of a Myron and a Phidias, that how does it that it's overcome? So if you look initially at Western art, this is kind of like the Gothic era. So I think around like 900 or whatever, and think of like the birth of all these massive cathedrals. You still have a lot of elements of the classical to be found within it. You get all those kind of like statues of like different sort of characters from like Christian religion, or even just like actual people that are like found on the what do you call it, the facade of like of different cathedrals. I don't remember the exact. I think I can actually. So Spengler, if anybody's listening and is interested, at the back of Decline of the West, Spengler has these wonderful charts where he kind of maps all this cultural stuff out, and it's really great. Yeah, he just calls it cathedral sculpture. And at this point, like there is still sort of like a classical pseudomorphosis to be found within the Gothic style. If you look at like those statues, but what happens, what Spengler says, is that oftentimes within these cultural developments, you see some sort of like revolt. And that's like really what the Renaissance represented for Spengler. There was kind of this revolt in the West against the Gothic style. And rather than like an overcoming of the pseudomorphosis, it actually kind of leaned itself more into it. You think of like where the Renaissance really happened. This is like an Italian movement. This is happening in the Epimethean South, where things are looking backwards rather than the Promethean vision of the future.
Yeah, it's Hellenism, essentially. Yes, it's the Hellenist revival.
Exactly. They're going back to all of these Greco-Roman ideals. They're uncovering all of these statues and works of art, and they're getting all of these Greek texts from the downfall of Constantinople. And there's the rebirth that is associated with it, and they're trying to kind of work itself out. And what Spengler says, though, and this is one of the things that is kind of always, I don't know, I've always had a hard time with it, because it seems like he's kind of stretching the argument here, where he's saying that, even in this Renaissance art where you see like the rebirth of like a classical style, that even in the depth of it, you still see something very Faustian. One of the things he says is that like, even when you look at like Michelangelo's David, that there's still some sort of soul that you feel emanating from the sculpture that you don't feel in classical art. For the classical art, it's all about appearance. There's no soul inside of it that you can kind of ascertain. It's purely a visual, visage almost, completely without soul. It's extremely Apollonian in a lot of ways. There's no depth to it. There's just like the bodily structure. But what he's saying is that something like in the eyes, something in the eyes of Michelangelo's David, the veins of his hand, you get this sense of an inner coursing being within him that you don't see in Greek art. And in that sense, you can kind of feel that Michelangelo was sculpted by a Faustian man, that there is this sense of the individual I am that just kind of is shouted from the sculpture.
Exactly. And even like the declining in the West, sort of by the time you get to the 19th century, way ahead of the Renaissance, I would say that academicism is also this dramatic contrast between what is like very, I would say, dead and formalistic and very much rational and Apollonian, as opposed to the pure Dionysianism of something like Impressionism. I mean, compare compare even like would be a good example. Even like an early Mammoth, compare that to you know to Bugaro, and you'll see like that dramatic contrast. But that so I don't know, but maybe Spengler is probably stretching the argument, but because there's other people that say that like Greek art has a life to itself and does have a spirit within the excellence of it, within the excellence of the body. I know that's what what's the art critic, the first art critic, Wangelman? Is that how do you pronounce his name?
I
Rangelman?
don't know. I don't really. Are you thinking Winkelmann or I don't
Winkelmann,
know?
Winkelmann, yes,
Yeah.
yeah. The like there's still like what would you say? Do you think that maybe Spengler was making too much of it, that distinction? I mean, there certainly is a sort of excellence in a spirit within the Greek sculpture. But yeah.
I think the more I've studied it, the more I think actually Spengler is kind of correct. You think of Nietzsche's kind of discussion of Greek aesthetics in The Birth of Tragedy, the Apollonian versus the Dionysian. It's that Dionysian element that we see in Michelangelo's David that we don't see in the Polycletus statue. You
Yeah.
know, you don't get any sort of sense of the inner world in Polycletus. There's no sort of the individual in the world experiencing being as such. That there's something kind of hollow but extremely still beautiful in classical sculpture. And another thing that Spengler points out is that the Faustian art is obsessed with the individual and correctly getting the individual right.
Yes.
While classical sculpture, everybody is sculpted as to type. So it's kind of always like the exact same type for the wise old man pontificating or for like the soldier. It's always sculpted as to a type rather than correctly getting the features of the individual correct. Think of Rembrandt as like the Faustian artist par excellence in terms of correctly getting somebody in portraiture.
Yes.
And that's something you just don't really see in
the
classical
likeness.
art. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, even Polycletus, if you look at it, like the way that the hip muscles attach to the core, the way that the kneecaps are constructed, it very much is like if you're taking, say, a drawing aid, like in a very rigid structure, like say Bridgman, right? And then you're like applying it to like the human form. I mean, it's good to like get the feel of it, but eventually like your own intuitive sense of looking directly at that muscle structure, like that's obviously very different to get likeness of it. But whereas like with the Greeks, you do have this rigidness, this rigidity to the way that they have this perfected form. Which I mean, some people nowadays they would say that. I mean, they would say that's a good thing, that it's very rigid, that you should aspire to this classical archetypal man with the glorious, rippling physiques. But no, but then there is this like sensuousness and this likeness towards, by the time you get to Rembrandt, I mean, the way that his, like the portraits are filled with light and filled with like the direct characterization, not just likeness in terms of correct proportion or correct correct facial features, but the way that they carry on a sort of expression, like that's what the key difference is. You get the sort of the individualization of the work of art. I guess maybe that's what Spengler was talking about, right? So
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
But then how does music become like the but sorry, go ahead, Spengler. Sorry.
No, let's actually talk about music. It's a good point to bring it in, the music. So one of the things that I guess Spengler is talking about, I don't know why I say I guess I need to work on my public speaking skills. Spengler is saying that there's a sort of process and development that you see at play in a culture's art. Now, for the Greeks, this was the emphasis on the body. So Greek art actually kind of begins musically. You think of like a lot of those like Spartan musicians, like Terpander, Alcman. These are kind of like musical poets, like lyricists in a lot of ways.
Like bards.
Yeah, like bards. But they're also creating like poetry, not just like Homeric bards, but like they're if you listen to like their instruments as well, like what is it, the aulos? I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's like kind of like that Greek double flute thing. A lot of the music that they're producing, if you listen to like reproductions of it, you can kind of get the sense of it. There's not a lot of harmony. It's based on kind of like this on structure, the structural element of it. There's like a lot of, we'll just leave it at structure. And you get this almost bodily sense. Like Spengler says, that was kind of plastic for the ear, right? It was kind of like a sort of sculpture for the ear to kind of, for the Greek to kind of enjoy. But it's quickly kind of abandoned, and you see the emergence of these more, frescoes within Greek art. And what happens is there's kind of this pseudomorphic influence. You think of like the Egyptians. Like the Egyptians had extremely large statues that kind of portrayed their, their pharaohs and whatnot. But one thing that Spengler says is interesting is that Egyptian sculptures, they're always supposed to be meant to be viewed from the front. And he's right. Like you think of it, like it's always like a front. This idea of like you're supposed to be viewing it from the front. Like there's not like a whole lot of interesting details like on the side or even behind it. But you think of like Greek sculptures, and it's actually 3-dimensional. You can see the body and nearby space all around it. So that's an interesting idea. But back to the frescoes. The Greek artist is basically trying to pull the individuals within the frescoes out of like off of the wall and put them into real 3rd-dimensional space. That's basically the development of Greek art for Spengler in a lot of ways. Now, if you look back to the Faustian West, it's kind of a very different development. So it's starting with the sculpture in a lot of ways because of that influence of the Greeks. And you see it within the Gothic cathedral, and you see it within the Renaissance. But it's not exactly intuitive to Faustian man. And Spengler says it's kind of a fad that, dies out like rather quickly. Like the Renaissance is somewhat short-lived. And then, art and its heyday moves up north. You think of like Albrecht Dürer.
Oh, yes.
And the kind of like Northern Renaissance in a lot of ways. And that's kind of a significant shift away from Greco-Roman ideals being revived in art. And there's actually, a very, there's a broodiness at play within his art. And it's also extremely detailed if you look at a lot of his engravings, I guess.
Yeah, the wood engravings and also
the wood cuts.
Yes.
And for Spengler, he's saying that there's this kind of process of etherealization, I guess you could say.
Yeah, the beginnings of abstraction come about from this as well. Yes.
Yeah. So for Faustian man, if he wants to, portray his innate idea of infinite space, the sculpture is just not going to be a great avenue for that. And consequently, it's abandoned. Like one of the things that Spengler says is, if you look at the entirety of Faustian sculpture, it's actually kind of like a short list. Like if you put it in comparison to music or to painting, there's not really that much sculpture. An interesting idea that we kind of put all of our, I don't know if it's like a video game, like we're putting like all of our cultural points in different skill branches or something.
Different
so
mediums.
We're focused exactly. And so within the painting, we see this process of I'm trying to think of where we should start. Let's just actually go back to music. So Spengler, he creates this division between the castle and the cathedral. So the castle is interested in like the troubadours, like that sort of style of music. Just kind
beginning
of
secular music as well. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. He calls it secular music. Ideas of like chivalry, kind of a celebration of life. I mean, of course, like these people are coming from like the south of France, so of course the weather's nice, so they're all happy. Chivalry, just romances. This is the sort of thing that interests like the secular music of the troubadours. But in the cathedral, Spengler says this interesting line: the cathedral is music, while the castle makes music. So the castle has its court and it has its musicians that kind of just like entertain and perform to kind of to entertain and to make people enjoy the music, which is very sensuous and just pleasant to the ear. But the cathedral, there is like this greater music at play. Spengler, I think he's right when he's talking about music for Western man of the highest spiritual sense really should be played inside of the cathedral, because you get the sense of like the vaulted ceilings of a Gothic cathedral and the infinite sense of space that the music also kind of portrays as it takes up that infinite space of the vaulted ceilings. So you have the castle with
reaching
its
that highs, it's enveloping that space of the cathedral. Yeah.
exactly. And there's also this sense of harmony as well. You think of like the Gregorian chants and everybody singing together, this deeper resonance. And then you think of the musical instrument, the organ, and you think of some Bach music and the deep notes of the organ playing and the whole cathedral kind of shaking, and you can kind of feel this whole organism like come to life with someone like Bach. There's like this greater spiritual element. And what Spengler is saying is both the music and the painting is that it's tending toward this etherealization of becoming, he says even like the paintings are becoming music in a lot of ways.
Oh, yes.
And yeah, I guess that's like really it, just like this tendency toward like releasing, like a release from matter, a release from the body, and like pure Germanic spirit.
Yeah. By the time you get to the 20th century, I mean, you have, lyrical abstraction, you have Georgia O'Keeffe, you have this sort of attempt at painting to represent music itself. And that's an interesting idea. How Kandinsky, really, I mean, Kandinsky is Spenglerian in that sense of the painting trying to reflect spirit of music and so forth. But it is funny though how, well, I mean, film nowadays and like the moving image, but music still carries with it, uh, I get in the one sense, still like there's this high culture, but also there's this vulgarization into like poptimism, into like youth culture, the way that we think of it from like the late 20th century to nowadays. Like, music is such an integral part of like quote unquote youth culture that it really defines identity in ways that other mediums can't, in ways that I mean, it's it's unfortunate for me as a painter and as a printmaker, but like in ways that like fine art and the plastic arts can't. Like music has really taken up like the template, but I would say cinema as well nowadays. I don't know, did Spengler talk about cinema at all or no?
No, he really didn't. I mean, he died in 1936, so kind of like before I think movies really became like great.
Yeah.
Like think of like what movies were like in his day. Not really that great. Not really like a high medium of art as they would later become, especially in like the I guess like the 40s and the 50s and 60s.
Oh yeah, but it's funny though. In Germany, it had the inklings of that though, in terms of what film could become. I mean, Metropolis came out in was it the 20s or 30s? I forget. But yeah, yeah. But it's funny how like cinema and the moving image then replaces all of this. Even I wouldn't say replace music, but in certain ways, I mean, the pop culture industry is like this weird union of music and film or television. It's kind of like hard. I mean, I wonder what Spengler would think of like the digital media nowadays, like sort of like a blending of all experience together. It's like, what can you even call culture nowadays, right? So,
I mean, I think you'd start perhaps looking at just photography. I think there's something
yeah,
very Faustian in photography in terms of you're just trying to capture the exact likeness of something. And photography does it better than perhaps any painter ever could, because it's quite literally capturing it. But at the same time, like you're kind of it's not a high art form in a lot of ways. It's a degeneration. I mean, I don't know. I think art photography is fine. It's cool, but it's not of the same high spiritual caliber as something
right.
like music or painting. But there is something very Faustian in it, right? It's the same thing as Rembrandt, as we were talking about, the capturing of likeness. So
Oh
to
yeah.
its credit, I suppose.
Oh, exactly. But also Spengler, when it comes to you made a note that you wanted to mention the color brown because Spengler has this great color analysis. Speaking of Kandinsky, who also like if you read his book on the spiritual and art, like how each color and each symbol has like a direct link to each other. Red as a certain affect, and the arrangement of it. But Spengler talks about the patina, or the color brown. That's very important in terms of like what it represents in Faustian civilization. You wanted to talk about that before we move on to another topic, but yeah.
Yeah, so absolutely. One of the things, so when I was first reading Spengler, I was, not at all educated on matters of art history or anything like that. So a lot of this went over my head the first time I was reading it. But when I got to his like multi-page spurg out over the color brown, that's when I realized I was reading the work of a great man. He spends like quite a few pages just spurging out over how important the color brown is to Faustian man. And it's an interesting, argument. So what he's saying, that there's a sense of overcoming nature in this emphasis on the brown. He says that brown is like the only color you don't see in the rainbow, and
Yeah.
therefore it's kind of outside of the purview of nature. So when you see this kind of brown light that emanates in Western art, especially like the Dutch masters and Rembrandt, everything's like these hues of a brown, really.
Yeah, they come from sepia and Motter Lake and different earth colors like umbers. Yes, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
siennas.
So it's what he's saying is that there's kind of like this overcoming of nature, outside of like the laws that govern kind of like how light really should be. Like there shouldn't really be that sort of like brown light. Like where in nature do you really see a brown light? You really don't, and that's kind of contrasted against what he says were kind of like the real colors of classical civilization, which he say are kind of like the warmer colors, like yellow and red. But it does make sense though, this greenish brownish hue that you see in the West, because again, like where is the West from? It's from the dark and murky forests of Germany, where everything's kind of greenish and brownish. We are forest dwellers in a lot of ways.
But it's funny how that abstraction from natural color is then equated with color, equated with nature, though, because brown tones are always like denoted for the earthiness and the symbolism of it, and also like just in terms of the realist landscape painting. Brown was often used as like that is like the primary color of creating the landscape itself, and creating Grisaille as well. What's behind the fully developed painting, the sketch is in brown, but it's very funny how that works that way. Of course, by the time you get Impressionism, now brown leaves the scene. Now it becomes about those primary colors that are worked in such a way as to reflect the light and shadow, right? So now brown exits the sort of the umbers and the siennas. They exit the stage of shadow work. Now it becomes the blues and the natural colors, and it's like almost like Impressionism's this weird return to form.
Yeah. Or for Spengler, it's a kind of like a degeneration. It's a departing of what is natural to Faustian man, because so much of it, has been exhausted by the 1800s.
Yeah.
I'm going to read another little bit of Spengler, because Spengler, this is something that Spengler doesn't get credit for. Decline of the West is so poetic at so many different points. I would highly recommend, if anybody listening to this thinking this large tome of the philosophy of history is going to read something like Hegel or something extremely, onerous and difficult to read. It's really not. It's extremely accessible and it's beautiful. So now I'm going to read. This atmospheric brown, which was entirely alien to the Renaissance, is the unrealist color that there is. It is the one major color that does not exist in the rainbow. There is white light and yellow and green and red and other lights of the most entire purity. But a pure brown light is outside the possibilities of the nature that we know. All the greenish brown, silvery, moist brown, and deep gold tones that appear in their splendid variety with Giorgione grow bolder and bolder in the great Dutch painters and lose themselves toward the end of the 18th century have the common quality that they strip nature of her tangible actuality. They contain, therefore, what is almost a religious profession of faith. We feel that here we are not very far from Port Royal, from Leibniz, with Constable on the other hand, who is the founder of the painting of civilization. It is a different will that seeks expression, and the very brown that he had learnt from the Dutch meant to him not to what it had meant to them, destiny, God, the meaning of life, but simply romance, sensibility, yearning for something that was gone, memorial of the great past of the dying art. And yeah, I'll end it there. But yeah, there is sort of that more earthy soil aspect that you see that's very much at play in the Faustian Man. Again, it's kind of relating back to its roots in the forest, but to also bring in what you mentioned, the patina.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Spengler says is the reason why we're all so obsessed with the Greek marbles is because they're ruins. That because they're not in their heyday. If they were, and they were painted with like their red and yellow colors, we wouldn't like
they
it.
Were painted
really.
as by POC people. Remember that they were painted as, yeah. So that's what they say. That's the argument. The famous viral tweet. So yeah. Yes. Historian here, his art historian here. They were all by POC people painted. Yeah, go ahead.
We was Greeks.
Yeah.
But think about it. Like, I want to look at the touch-ups of Greek sculptures and buildings, and I want to say I like it, but I really don't. Like when I see it has like all of like the flashy colors and like that all the statues were actually painted with how the people actually looked, with like, you know, peach skin and blonde hair.
They look kitschy. They look kitschy.
It looks extremely kitsch. I do not like it. And so that's one of the things that Spengler's saying, that if we saw it how it actually was, we'd be like, what the hell is this shit? It looks fucking awful. Yeah. But because it has this patina to it, there's this sense of time and temporality
to it. Yeah.
Yeah. That we really get to see because one of the things that Spengler says is that Faustian man is obsessed with time and the procession of time. Well, for the classical man, he has no real sense of time, that he doesn't really care about the veracity of ancient history or whatever. He can kind of just like play fast and loose with it. But for us, we see it, we're like, wow, this is, you know, from ancient times, from a bygone era. And it's just so remarkable that we see the literal effect of time with which we're so obsessed on the marble. We see how time has weathered it away and how it's, you know, grown like mossy and a little decrepit in a lot of ways. And we're just, you know, we're fascinated with it. That's kind of like our not, what's the word there? Like we're obsessed with decay in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's why Anselm Kiefer is like really, I think, one of the best examples of a painter who plays with this cosmology of decay and time. I mean, that's what John David Ebert talks about in his book, Art After Metaphysics. But it's funny though, like how in some ways we're returning to that sense of ahistoricalness, even in the work of art, as I argue in my upcoming book. But you know, it's like funny how like we think of this like new ahistorical postmodern being as like this wholly original thing, but in some ways it's like a return to form of going back to the earth, as Spengler said, of not really a blonde beast, but let's say the bug man of history that lacks a history is like a weird return to those originary natures of civilization on its declining end. It's sort of like how, you know, you come into this world in diapers, and in the old folks' home, you go out of this world in diapers. It's like this weird, you know, inverted form of originary nature. How the fact that like most people lack a history nowadays, or history becomes this like abstraction or referent, right? And it's funny what you said about the statue, about how it doesn't have the same connotation. That's, you know, Spengler is exactly where Heidegger is getting his essay, you know, on the origins of the work of art, how the artwork can die because it lacks that gravity, that comportment in a culture. It's funny, there's like so many points between Spengler and Heidegger that, like, you know, people that are, you know, brave enough in modern academia to study Heidegger, they really sort of overlook the Spenglerian element, right? Because of course, like I know like a lot of people that still take Heidegger seriously, they try to well, you know,
yeah,
downplay his certain affiliations politically, but you know.
Oh well, yeah, we can. That's a whole other can of worms. I do think Heidegger had a bad tendency of kind of just like plagiarizing from the people that he read, and
Yeah.
then just being very very annoying in his dismissals of them. I'm not a fan of Heidegger personally, but
Really, eh?
we yeah yeah I don't. It's very interesting to me that so what Being in Time came out in 1927, and Spengler doesn't say a single word about it. I don't think he had any sort of interest in Heidegger or academic philosophy of that time. I
Hmm.
don't know. Heidegger is just not my thing, but there are a lot of good Heidegger weebs out there, I guess. So
Oh
I
yeah.
won't say that they're all bad. But regarding crap, what were we talking about? I kind of lost my train of thought.
Ahistorical postmodern man. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is what Spengler calls like the Fellaheen. This is kind of like a person stripped of any sort of like greater historical purpose. But another thing that's important to say is that this is kind of like the life that most people live, even in the good days of culture.
Oh
It's
yeah.
only really just like the aristocracy and the great men that are even capable of actualizing whatever potentialities there are within a culture. And a great man is very expansive here. It includes artists, philosophers, architects, but also politicians and generals and kings and all that great stuff. So, but yeah, the mass of humanity will always live kind of like an ahistorical peasant sort of existence.
Yeah. Yeah, they live to the earth. They're wedded to the earth, as he says over and over again in like the second half of Decline of the West. Or they're well, now they're wedded. I guess they're no longer wedded to the earth, but it is interesting though that we have this obsession over the democratization of knowledge, but yet those forms still play out where the vast majority of humanity nowadays has access to the information that only the aristocrats cared about, but their taste is more vulgar and stupid and low IQ than ever. Or like we love the pretense of intellect and we love the pretense of high culture, but it's mediated through like very like low culture memes, sorry, memes, but also memes. Yeah, but I guess memes as well. Like you mentioned, Yuval Noah Harari. There's this tweet that went around recently. Like, what is a stupid person's, what is a stupid person's view of a smart person? Like, who's a
Mm.
smart person to stupid people? And of course, like people posted Noval Harari. I posted Elaine de Bottom, but like, of course, people are usually posting the Hitchens, Lex Friedman, Jordan Peterson. Like, it's very funny how at the time that we're obsessed with the democratization of knowledge, yet we still have such low level, barely sentient interests, but we love the pretense of intellect more than the actuality of it.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
aristocracy is in the blood, right? It's not about accessibility. If it
right.
were right, I guess if it were about accessibility, we'd live in the most accessible age ever. We would be teeming with Goethe's and Michelangelo's, but we're clearly not, and we're not even a shadow of those ages. So Spengler's right when he's saying that it's something different. It's about like the aristocracy. It's about great men, what they actually want to do. And one of the things, and maybe you're not going to like to hear this, but Spengler says at this point when he's writing the book, art is essentially dead.
Yeah, yeah,
You might basically get like a few great works of art, but they're really the mastery of the self rather than some sort of indication of the culture as a whole. Like
right. Yes, yes,
yeah, they stand out in the background, and if you look in the background, it's all just trash and filth and kitsch. Um, so in this post-cultural world, civilization, right? That's like what civilization is. It's post-culture. What do
exactly.
you do? What do you do if you have these sort of creative impulses and you want to, do something and be great? Well, you look at like what the other civilizations were doing at their comparative stage in their development. So like we're basically entering in the period of late Roman Republican politics with the emergence of the Caesars, the building of empires. The Romans were very into engineering and eventually creating aqueducts and all sorts of amazing feats of engineering. That's the period we live in now. So the Faustian man's creative energies are no longer going into the arts, but they should be going into I guess Elon Musk riding rocket ships around the universe and
Yeah.
things of that nature. And yeah, one of the things that Spengler. This is my favorite quote. I'm gonna have to find it. I got my book here. I'm flipping through it. One of the best quotes within Spengler's Decline of the West, and it's where you really see that this is a kind of a call for young men. He says, "And I can only hope the men of the new generation may be moved by this book to devote themselves to technics instead of lyrics, the sea instead of the paintbrush, and politics instead of epistemology.
Oh
Better
no!
could not do." So yeah, it's time
Oh
to
no!
it's time to delete your podcast and become a lawyer.
It's time to take down my easel.
Yeah.
Get rid of my jeweler's loop printmaking. Oh my god. Oh, this is like he took the Varg pill. That's what Varg Viker's he denounced doing music, and now he's like, well, you have to devote yourself to the coming apocalypse. So I wonder maybe if Varg is a Faustian figure. I mean, he did essentially create like a whole new version of music and metal itself. So it's probably, I don't know, is Varg a Spenglerian figure? Probably.
I don't know. I really don't know that much about Varg other than the
memes?
what I saw on Twitter about his daughter or something.
Oh god.
We don't need to get into that.
Oh, yeah, very deep lore. But no, but it's very fascinating though. I mean, but it's funny because everyone that came after Spengler has also declared the death, or even came before him. Hegel declared the death of art. Then after Spengler, Arthur Danto declared the death of art. But yeah, so still art persists in some ways. And if anything, you would say that the art that the art that matters to a civilization nowadays is just the art that's terrible. The art that becomes hyper political kitsch, neoliberal kitsch. But no, but that's a very pertinent. It's a very pertinent view. How even Spengler said it was exhausted. And I mean, by the time you get to the cinema and the moving image, a lot of people have speculated that that's the end of painting. That's it. I mean, the moving image takes over from the narrative function of painting itself. So it's very interesting that way. One thing that I wanted to ask you before we get into spicier topics, and by the way, at the time of recording this very day, I don't know if you've been browsing Twitter while we were talking, but I just saw my notifications. Apparently, Ted Kaczynski has died.
No.
Yeah.
Are you serious?
Yeah. No, he's died. Yeah, they declared. Yeah, he's dead.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
Rest in peace to a real one.
Rest in peace to Ted Kaczynski. I think, like, to tie in though, what would you think from a Spenglerian perspective of anarcho-primitivism and the sort of Kaczynskiite critique of the modern world and technics? I mean, to keep the theme of his untimely death. Yeah.
Jeez, I feel like the Trump video. Like, really?
You're telling me this
now
for the first time?
Yeah,
he was an amazing man. He led an amazing life.
Yeah. Holy cow! There's a lot to process right now. I mean, yeah. So Kaczynski and the whole machine, right? Now for Spengler is actually saying that you should probably kind of master the machine. Well, Ted just wants to completely tear it down, right? He wants to quite literally bomb it out of existence.
Total Butlerian jihad, yeah.
Exactly. But for Spengler, he really saw, what made Faustian civilization in particular so amazing and unique was its goal to understand the world as it truly was. That's the significance of like our great astronomers, of the Copernican revolution, not to just kind of dogmatically understand, the structure of the cosmos, but to boldly uncover it and to understand it as it really is. And other cultures didn't have that sort of impulse. Like maybe you say, oh, well, the Greeks were doing these sorts of calculations, but they didn't have like the technology, to really test everything.
Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast, where every Wednesday there are interesting guests, amazing ideas, solo streams, and discussions on a diverse array of topics from art, philosophy, history, and more. The free version will be available both here on YouTube and as a downloadable link on Anchor and Spotify, as well as on Substack. Each week, the full, uncensored, and spicier version will now be available on both Patreon and Substack, where you will have access to the full archive of both Content Minded and of Giant Reviews, where I break down interesting texts every week, including other exciting paywalled articles and good content. Thank you all. Please like, share, and subscribe. God bless. Goodbye. Help keep the content renaissance alive. Too sweet.